member of our staff for the last couple of semesters. And over the summer, I had the opportunity to talk to Angela quite a bit about developing a class in literature and the environment. And JCCC has a very robust sustainability program, and we're hoping to develop, actually we have kind of developed a course in history, literature, and the environment, and we would love for you to sign up when that's available. First of all, here in the audience today, we have family members of Anthony Funari. There's Mr. Funari's father, John Funari, his wife, Kim, Linda, and there we go, and then his brother-in-law, Alan. Okay, so just to review a bit, Anthony Funari grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He attended the University of Pittsburgh and the State University of New York at Stony Brook. And after completing his master's degree, he taught for a number of years in high schools in New York City. In 2005, he was awarded a fellowship at Lehigh University to work on his doctorate. His dissertation is magnificent. He managed to win the Outstanding Dissertation Award at Lehigh University in 2010. His dissertation is also being published as a book. You can find it on Amazon.com. His research has been nominated for the Council of Graduate Schools Outstanding Dissertation in Humanities, and that is huge. And it's a huge nomination, and we're very proud that he's on our staff. Anyway, his book is Francis Bacon and 17th-Century Intellectual Discourse. His work takes up some of the ideas that I really personally enjoy thinking about that have to do with the relationship between a knower and a known, and how a knower knows things. And this is particularly relevant to the history of science. And actually, seeing how I'm a person who teaches poetry, it also has to do with what a poet can know about the world and say about the world. And he's going to combine these two ideas. What can a scientist or a poet say with certainty about reality? For science, truth is uncomplicating the tangle of natural processes in the world in order to arrive at an elegant description of how the world works and how it can be controlled. But I guess our question is this evening, what is nature and what can be known? For most of us in the 21st century, we believe that we can know things and we can shape our future. We believe in progress and that what science tells us is good and true. But Francis Bacon had a slightly different perspective on this. He's the father of the scientific method. Anthony was quoted as saying earlier this week that we see science as always progressing. He said, for Francis Bacon, it wasn't about discovery, it was about recovery of that knowledge and power of Eden. Going back to the perfect world and trying to describe it. I love that idea because in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, he was talking with a wonderful literary scholar, and he said, in one of his most famous essays, that literature is a nostalgic activity. You're always going back to recover what is lost. And so here today we have this wonderful combination of Anthony's idea of Francis Bacon recovering the lost Eden through science. In literature, we're recovering the lost world through poetry, and at the same time we're looking at the history of science and going back and looking at its premises and its assumptions. And I hope you enjoy this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you all for coming out this evening. I'd particularly like to thank just a few people off the bat. Andy Anderson, he's the chair of the English and Journalism Department here at Johnson County, for getting the ball rolling on this book talk, and to Julie Haas for all of her organizing and publicity efforts. And especially to my wife, Kim, whose support, without whose support, I could never have actually written this book. Okay, so let's begin. I would like to begin with an iconic image from the summer of 2010. I'm sure we all recognize the live feed from the gushing Macondo wellhead that occupied our TV for nearly 4 months. I would like to direct our attention to just a few numbers associated with what I pray will be the greatest environmental disaster of the 21st century. The first number is 11. That is the number of oil rig workers who died on April 20th, 2010. The next number is 1,000. That is the amount in barrels of oil that gushing into the Gulf that BP initially reported. The next two numbers are an estimate, 56,000 to 68,000. This is the amount in barrels per oil per day that Timothy Crone, a professor at Columbia University, estimated was gushing into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I'd like to place this ecological disaster in perspective for us. First off, let's begin with the Exxon Valdez spill of '89 that left 354,840 barrels of oil spilled over Prince William Sound. Now let's go back a little bit to 1979, the Itox spill, another Gulf oil spill that released 4.5 million barrels of oil into the Gulf. Now to the Gulf oil spill of 2010. 6.6 million barrels, or 204.6 million gallons of crude oil that is estimated to have spilled into the Gulf of Mexico from April to September. Excuse me. But the number I'd like to focus on right now is 1.5 million. 1.5 million gallons of Corexit 9500 and 9527. This was the amount of chemical dispersant that BP used to disperse the oil. And it began this on, April 29th. Now, not only was these chemical dispersants applied to surface oil, but 800,000 gallons were applied directly to the gushing wellhead. Now, what does this technology do? It does not disappear the oil. What it does, it reduces the size of the oil droplets by a factor of 10, sinking or entrenching them below the waves into the water column itself. These chemical dispersants, are designed to make it easier for oil-munching bacteria to break down or degrade the oil. Now, BP's decision to use these chemical dispersants stands out as one of the most controversial decisions during this entire ecological disaster. First off, applying these chemical dispersants to the wellhead made it much more difficult to estimate the amount of crude oil that spilled into the Gulf. This is the method by which the EPA assesses fines, by the way. Also, the long-term environmental and health effects of these chemical dispersants are unknown. In 2005, the National Research Council reported, and I quote, the current understanding of key processes and mechanisms in the dispersant use is inadequate to confidently support a decision to apply dispersants. Now, one of the questions that the National Research Council pointed out that is left unanswered is what will be the byproducts from the bacteria eating this sunken oil. Now, ironically, the United Kingdom has actually banned the use of chemical dispersants when cleaning up oil spills. Now, the EPA did mandate that the British Petroleum halt the use of these chemical dispersants on May 10th. This was a mandate that BP ignored. Now, there's a lot of scientific disagreement as to what is actually occurring below the waves with regards to this sunken oil. Terry Hazen, an ecologist with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, is quoted in Times-Picayune as saying that the oil-munching bacteria were able to consume tiny droplets could validate the use of the corrective chemical dispersant for helping to speed the biodegradation of the oil. So, for Professor Hazen, he gives us a comforting tale of how our technology and natural processes can work together. However, there was a different interpretation. Samantha Joy, a marine biologist from the University of Georgia, testified in front of Congress that the use of these chemical dispersants could cause hypoxia or oxygen-depleted zones, what were reportedly or widely called dead zones, and when applied in the deep sea, could produce sulfur-rich water where oxygen is not so readily replenished. Now, my point I'd like to emphasize here is that this was a moment where we used our technology unscientifically. It was only after these chemical dispersants were used was there an attempt to scientifically understand our technological intervention into the Gulf. So how do we understand the motivation behind BP's decision to use this little studied technology? Well, first off, we can understand it as a type of fog of war, where BP's desperation to try any measure to curb the environmental impact. We can all remember the top kill, the top hat, the kill shot, the static kill. Heck, even Kevin Costner got involved. There was also a public relations benefit. The ecological effects of this oil spill could no longer be observed readily, i.e., say, in oil-drenched pelicans, but had to be inferred, that is, in poisoned zooplankton. Excuse me. As Samantha Joy rightly pointed out, what BP did was sacrifice the deep water for the beaches. Now, what I would like to suggest that given the scientific uncertainty surrounding this technology, that we can understand BP's decision to use these chemical dispersants as based on a belief, a cultural belief in humanity's ability to restore nature, that we can return environmental harmony to nature through our technology, that through invention we can redeem our environmental sins. Now, this is a cultural belief that can be traced back to the central figure in tonight's talk, Sir Francis Bacon. One of the most influential and certainly one of the most controversial intellectuals to come out of Renaissance England. Francis Bacon was an essayist, a philosopher, a courtier, a lawyer. He was born into a politically very well-connected family. His father, Nicholas Bacon, served as keeper of the Great Seal for Elizabeth I. And by marriage, he was nephew to Robert Cecil, Elizabeth I's longtime Lord Chancellor. Excuse me. However, his political career didn't take off until James I ascended the throne in 1603. Bacon would eventually go on to serve as James I's Lord Chancellor, only to be brought down by bribery charges in 1620. Humorous note, his defense was, yes, I accepted the gifts, but they didn't affect my judgment. But the modern legacy of Francis Bacon comes to us as the founding voice in the scientific revolution. Now, he wasn't a Robert Boyle or Sir Isaac Newton. There is no Bacon's law of. What Bacon was a scientific propagandist. He set out the intellectual framework for what would become the modern scientific thought. Now, he called his program the Great Instauration, or what's known as the Great Restoration or Renewal. Excuse me. Now, I'd like to direct our attention to one of Bacon's foundational texts in his intellectual program, the Novum Organum, or what's known as the New Tool, which was published in 1620. Now, it's really impressive, the grandeur of Bacon's project. He calls for nothing less than the renewal of all human learning. He says, quote, "The sciences are in an unhappy state and have made no great progress, and that a path must be open to man's understanding entirely different from that known to men before us." What Bacon says here basically is that he's lamenting that human learning has not produced greater control over the natural world. Excuse me. So one of the central pillars of Baconian thought is that knowledge must now be for human benefit. It must benefit human life. And at the beginning of his book here, he states this: human knowledge and human power come to the same thing. For where the cause is not known, the effect cannot be produced. For Bacon, learning must be devoted to understanding nature's processes so that they can be manipulated for our benefit. Now, we have to understand something here. In a pre-scientific era, nature was the dominant character here. Nature was in control. And it was Bacon who tried to invert this. He wanted to flip the power structure. Now, in referring to this Novum Organum, or new tool, what Bacon's really talking about is what we consider scientific thought, or a scientific way of thinking. Some characteristics of Baconian thought are, materialism. Knowledge is going to be limited to that which can be experienced through our senses. Objectivity. Truth comes when we distance ourselves from the thing we're studying. Experimentalism. As we know, scientific thought moves from observable data to possible theories, and not vice versa. But a very important point here. Bacon was the one who rejected classical learning. That is, as he sets out here, truth is rightly described as the daughter of time, not authority. Now, this was very radical in Bacon's day. As we all know, the Renaissance, we think of it as the rebirth of classical learning. We recovered those texts of Plato, of Aristotle. Well, there was a school of thought called humanism that looked to those texts as being the golden age. That they were the height of human learning, the height of human intellectual achievement. Bacon threw that out. Bacon basically repositions the early 17th century natural philosopher not in a diminished present, looking to a golden age of learning, but on the cusp of an era of discovery, a new age in learning. And actually, if we look here, this cover is very, very important. What we see depicted here are the pillars of Hercules. Those were considered the geographical boundaries of the classical world. Now, what we see depicted as well are the European explorers going off to discover, quote unquote, the New World. So what Bacon's doing in this color piece is equating what Christopher Columbus did in discovering the New World with what he was doing in coming up with a scientific thought. Excuse me. Now, however, discovery might not be the right word. Now, underlying Bacon's scientific writings, the ones that promoted scientific thought, the ones that started the scientific revolution, really, there's a story, a narrative, of both advancement and restoration. Bacon, in a sense, was looking to return humanity to an environmental harmony that was once existed in the Garden of Eden. And this is the distinction between how we understand science and how Bacon understood science. We see science as always moving us forward to some unknown point in the future. Bacon saw it as returning us to a pristine earlier moment, a moment we once had. As he sets out, let the human race only recover its God-given right over nature and be given the necessary power. So science opens a path of return, recovering dominion over the natural world that Adam once possessed in Eden. Now, so Bacon was telling us about recovering this power, that recovering this power would come through scientifically studying nature. Again, humanity's intellectual development is not about moving forward for Bacon, but about returning. Excuse me. Now, we have to understand, though, that this environmental harmony, this ecologically harmonious state, is dependent on us for Bacon. That for Bacon, nature is dependent on humanity to restore harmony. As we can see in this quote, man seems to be a thing in which the world centers, so that if he were away, all things would stray and fluctuate without end or intention. For all things are made subservient to man, and he receives use and benefit from them all. So for Bacon, environmental harmony comes through our active management of the natural world. Now, Bacon, in the decades following his death, would become the foundational voice in England's emerging scientific communities, particularly the Royal Society, the preeminent scientific body of the 17th century. Now, represented up here is the cover to the Royal Society's charter. And I'd like to point to a couple characters out here. Along what would be your left. Your left. This is Prince Rupert. He was the first president of the Royal Society. Now, in the center, the buff, that is Charles II. He was the king at the time. He came crowned with the baby. And on the right is Francis Bacon. Excuse me. Now, the members of the Royal Society not only adopted Baconian thought or Baconian science, but they also adopted his rhetoric, his narrative, if you will, of scientific advancement and recovery. In his poem to the Royal Society, Abraham Cowley places Bacon in a heroic role, a role of restoring humanity to dominion over nature, prefigured in a lost inheritance. That is, the dominion that we can have over nature has not been has been unforfeited by man's rebellious sin. Okay, so to summarize Bacon's narrative here, scientific advancement is more about recovery than discovery. Baconian journey is a return to an earlier pristine moment made possible through our technology. And nature becomes that which must be managed. Okay, those are real important points. Excuse me. Now, alongside of Bacon's narrative of scientific advancement and discovery, there emerged a counter story, or a counter narrative, one that resisted Bacon's tale of advancement and recovery, of return. And this counter narrative has been very little studied by scholars and very little appreciated. Now, in my book, I look at three particular figures, literary figures of the 17th century. The first is the metaphysical poet John Donne. The next is Andrew Marvell. He was a poet of the English Civil War. And the last is John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester. He was a libertine poet. Now, what the story that they tell is one that questions humanity's ability to forge harmony with nature on our terms. That through technological manipulation or intervention, that the return Bacon grounds his advocating of the new science on is impossible, beyond our ability. And that actually scientific manipulation or technological intervention into nature distances us from ecological harmony, distances us from Eden. Now, the figure I would like to focus on for the rest of the talk is John Donne, particularly looking at how he resists Bacon's narrative in one of his most challenging writings, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions and Several Steps in My Sickness. Now, let me give you a bit of biographical context for this work. In November of 1623, John Donne came down with what was known as relapsing or spotted fever. Now, this sickness would last a month. The symptoms included a very high fever, that the body is practically incapacitated, and that during the disease progression, spots would appear on the body. Now, for the month of his illness, he was quarantined to his bedchamber at St. Paul's. And he very, very much believed, and he and his physicians believed, that he was on his deathbed. This situation was so serious that James I sent his own personal physician to attend on John Donne. Now, during the weeks of his sickness, Donne endured severe physical weakness. At one point in the devotions, Donne describes his body as iron fetters chaining him to his bed. So, and in part though, this weakness was due to the regimen of purgatives that his doctors prescribed for him. There's a humorous moment in devotions where Donne describes how his physicians are applying dead pigeons to the bottom of his feet to draw down the ill humors. This was humoral medicine at the time. Now, one of John Donne's latest biographers, John Stubbs, describes the experience of relapsing fever as being a very frightening split between the body and the mind.